to another episode of the Capital Press Club Legacy Podcast. This is episode number 9. I am your host, Dr. Colin Campbell, and joining me again today is Derek Kenny. You know Derek from working behind the scenes a lot, but he is also as adept in front of the camera where we talk about issues of the day. And in this weekend in Black history, we had the birth of Coretta Scott King, who was born on April 27th, 1927, I believe, and she would have been 97 years old today if she were alive. We also had the first time that a congressman had talked in front of the Supreme Court about racism on the railroad and trying to get equity and equality for African American passengers riding in first class. And this has to do with Democratic Congressman Arthur Mitchell, back in 1941, he spoke in front of the Supreme Court because he was riding on a train in first class, and he was told that because he is an N-word, he cannot ride in first class, and he was told to move to another car. That's when he decided to file a lawsuit and speak in front of the Supreme Court, ultimately to gain equality and equity for African American and Black American passengers riding on the railroad. Very big industry that employed a lot of Black people at that time. And he said, hey, we should all be treated fairly and equally. But those are our moments in Black history. But today we are going to be talking about other things. One of the first topics we're going to be talking about is the White House Correspondents' Association dinner, which happened this weekend. And of course, this is when you get the president and you get members of the media that get to roast each other. This year, the host was Colin Jost. He's the co-host of the Weekend Update on Saturday Night Live, a show that is known for its political satire. He co-hosts that show with Michael Che, and he's also married to Scarlett Johansson, as a guy who says he has one of the most punchable faces on the planet. So he does believe in some self-deprecating humor there. I will say I saw it. I don't know if you saw it, DK. He was okay. I don't know if he was one of the funniest comedians that they've hosted at the Correspondents' Dinner, but he did raise some laughs and some enthusiasm.
I didn't see it, but I think it's important for me as a person that's not really a national news media person to understand what's the importance of the White House Correspondents' period, and then why is there a White House Correspondents' dinner? What's significant about either?
Well, you've got the dinner itself and the association, which raises money for scholarships for aspiring journalists, and it creates an area where you have other journalists who can network, and I guess to relieve some pressure. Sometimes working at the White House or on the Hill can be high pressure, and sometimes it's nice to just sit back, relax a little bit, and laugh among colleagues, poke fun at the political situation, but ultimately they raise money and they have scholarships. Now, I wish I had an accurate figure for you on how much money they have raised to date or how much money they raised last night, but they have raised tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands. I know that there is probably somebody listening to this podcast who is probably screaming the figure out right now, and I apologize, I don't have that specific number for you, but they have raised a lot of money for scholarships. So that's a good cause. But again, it's always, they call it Nerd Prom. That's the unofficial name for the Correspondents' Dinner, because you have people dressed up and they're a little bit wonky, politically wonky. And it was a moment, definitely, as we saw an aged President Biden and making fun of the former president and about the former president's age and attentiveness as well. So there was kind of that one-sided jabbing, but that's expected at the Correspondents' Dinner.
Right. But then the White House Correspondents, though, there's a select group of journalists that have the ability, because not everyone can cover the White House the same way these guys do. They have a special relationship through their organizations to cover the White House when there's announcements and things of that nature. Is that kind of how White House correspondents work?
So as a White House correspondent, you can join this association. You pay into it like any kind of club or association or organization, and then you buy a ticket to the table if it's not sponsored by your employer, and you get to have a nice dinner, some libations. You get to hobnob with some of the politicos around town, also some of your colleagues in the business and the industry. It's a photo opportunity. I get to brag about it maybe to your friends later on. I attended once back in, I can't remember what year it was. It was many years ago that I attended. I believe Obama was president at the time. It was just people got to dress up and you get to see different people that you may not have seen for a while. And, it can be controversial. And there are some people who think that it shouldn't even exist. I suppose, understand that argument. If you think that journalists should be serious pretty much all the time and that there really shouldn't be much levity when there's so many serious issues happening around the world, I can understand that. But it also is a time to network, raise money for scholarships, and also to experience some comedic moments or moments of levity at a time when it is so serious. And we know that
Yep.
laughter and positive positive enthusiasm has its benefits as well, just chemically in our
Certainly.
bodies.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
a biological thing too.
Right. And I want to give a special shout out to the White House correspondents, that particular group, who, of course, the late great Bob Ellison was the president of, African American gentleman for the American Urban Radio Network. I've had the privilege of working with many moons ago, at Walls Communications, and of course another White House correspondent, member of the organization, April Ryan, who of course gained notoriety for covering the Trump White House, where she was, I guess, picked on by Trump. So, what has been the experience? What's the? I know you're not necessarily, this is not your wheelhouse. You're not necessarily a White House correspondent. But what do you imagine it's like covering the White House in that room where they have these special announcements, and they collected all the press from across America to make this announcement, and you have to ask this question for your network because there's very few small organizations there, right?
Yeah, for one, it's a very small room, and there are people there who do get some preference when it comes to asking questions. If you're a person who's been there and someone who's established, you get preferred choice. Like, for example, the AP does get to usually ask questions first, but then sometimes there can be an agenda, right? So they might ask other correspondents various questions before other correspondents get to chime in. So there's definitely a hierarchy there. I guess I say all that to say
Mm-hmm.
there is a hierarchy there. But depending on who is in office, it can be combative or not so combative, right? When April Ryan was working during the Trump administration, and she represents American Urban Radio Networks. Of course, there was some negative badinage that happened between press secretary and herself, where she felt targeted. You don't hear as much controversy like that now with Biden in office, and the questions that she asks, although they may be provocative in nature at times, it doesn't come across as caustic, or the relationship that she has with the White House press office doesn't come across as anything negative, because obviously journalists do have to ask probing questions. They may not always be appreciated, but that's part of what journalism is. It is to speak to systems of power, to make the powerful or the comfortably powerful a bit less uncomfortable, because there are disparities that are still occurring. There's still levels of inequity. So that has to be questioned. So I think that for her, I haven't spoken to her in a while, but if I was to assume how she was feeling, I would think that she feels that right now is a much more comfortable environment for reporters, our melanated reporters in the industry, than when Trump was in office, for example. And in fact, I did meet the person in head of who is in charge of outreach for journalists from the diaspora, I think about a month ago. I don't remember her name, but I do remember meeting her. And the fact that there is someone in that position who reaches out to various networks or reporters who are non-white or predominantly Black, I think that says something right there, because I do not remember a person in charge of that, at least in a very prominent position during the last administration.
I think, and that's very important too, though, to note that not only do we realize the importance of having diversity covering certain issues, but that the very top office in the nation sees the value in diverse, not only diverse readership, but diverse people sharing the news, different populations. Wow. What is the room like?
Yeah.
Were you able to visit the room? You say it's a small room?
Yeah, the Brady briefing room, it is kind of a small room. When people walk into it, they're a little bit surprised at how small it is. And I remember trying to cover the Obama administration during the transition from George W. Bush to the Obama administration, and it was standing room only. I was definitely not part of the hierarchy of the more well-known reporters, so I was standing usually in the back somewhere, and that's all there was to do. You couldn't sit down because it was so packed. There had so many journalists in there. And moving from the White House Correspondents Association dinner to something that was also supposed to be comedic, and that is Good Times, the animated remake of the show that's on Netflix right now, getting very mixed reviews as far as how funny it is or how unfunny it is in the way that it might reinforce stereotypes or embolden or augment bigotry because of the way that Black people are portrayed, even though it is a cartoon. Have you seen this show at all, DK? And if so, what do you think about it?
I've seen the show. So sometimes you get critiques because you haven't created a truly accurate version of the original. So Michael's personality, Michael's not even really there. JJ's personality is a little different. His presentation as a person is a little different. He's not a tall, wiry guy. The father is a little different. He has a job driving the car. With Florence, whatever. The characters are different. So these are basically, it's just so different. So there's different ways that people are probably upset about the cartoon. Because the cartoon is not a remake of the original Good Times. The cartoon is a show called Good Times about the descendants of the original Good Times family. Although they still live in the hood, I guess, but they're loosely affiliated with the original Good Times. And I think for some people that might be a bit of a shock in and of itself.
So you're saying that this new family is related to the original family in some way?
And watching it, my understanding is they referred to the grandparents a few times talking about certain things. I thought. Now, see, I might be totally wrong, okay? So please forgive me if I am. But this is definitely an updated version where the kids and the people are not exactly the same as what they were before. And it's not a mirrored comparison of the Malona, Florence, James Good Times of what the 70s or the 70s. It's not just a mirror of that. This is basically a whole different family. But I do want to say, which is great about it, is that it's still a nuclear family, because it really goes against the perception that African American families, particularly the ones that are of a certain economic class, don't have that nuclear structure where the father's there leading his family and the mother's there working with the father and those things. So I found it to be,
Well, I was going to ask, so what should be the responsibility looking at it through a media lens when you have some great actors? You've got Jay Farrow. Jay Farrow is a great impressionist. He's the guy who does he can do a good Chris Rock, a good Denzel Washington. I think he does Obama. He does a bunch of other comics as well. Tracy Morgan, I've seen him do. And then you have Marsai Martin, who was in Blackish, who came out with her own movie, executively produced her own movie in her teenage years. So a brilliant young woman there. You've got Yvette Nicole Brown, who I believe was in Community and several other shows. You've got Godfrey, who I believe is a comic who does not get credit because he can do a great Trump and he can do a good Obama. I don't think I've heard him do a Biden, but just the fact that he can switch between Trump and Obama pretty effortlessly is pretty impressive to me. You've got Cree Summer. Do you remember Cree Summer at all?
Yeah, the very beautiful Freddie from A Different World. Yeah,
exactly.
Never going to forget her. Yeah.
Yep. You've got Heidi Gardner from SNL. Speaking of SNL again, from when we were talking about it with Colin Jost, who hosted who's the comic at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Heidi Gardner is also on SNL currently, so she's in it as well. So what's the responsibility? You have all of this talent. Should it be in the way that they're portraying Black culture, even though it's comedic and cartoonish, or should there be more responsibility to kind of ignore or at least dismiss some of those stereotypes that have been attached to our society for so long?
I don't know. Now, and the first thing I guess is because I think some people have an issue with who produces this show. But if we recall, Norman Lear was the person that brought the show about, but he also brought about Archie Bunker, which was about a very conservative, borderline racist white man living.
Well, no, I don't think he was. I don't think he depicted a borderline
He's racist.
guy. I think
Yeah,
he was a racist guy
yeah,
who had some soft moments, I
yeah,
would say. But he was definitely a bigot and a racist. Yeah.
yeah. And that show introduced the very famous who? George Jefferson, the iconic
Yeah.
Black businessman that had a dry cleaners, who is the American dream of starting his own business and then creating a chain of businesses and moving on up to the east side. I mean, who doesn't know that story, right? So this is Norman Lear,
Right. Right.
and along with that, go ahead.
Okay, but we're talking about the 70s and 80s.
Mhm.
These shows came out in the 70s,
Yeah,
late 70s at that. Now we're in 2024.
yeah.
What should our shows be reflecting about us? Should they be again more responsible and more accurate about us now that many of us, not all of us, but many of
Mhm.
us have come up and moved on up? Or should it still stick to some of those tropes and stereotypes that I guess some people still find funny?
I think the biggest thing is that this is the cartoon is a comedy. And Good Times had some comedic moments, but that was a drama. It was a very serious issues were addressed. The situation was at times painful, where James didn't have a job, they weren't eating well. If you remember Penny being abused, the original Good Times was a drama. So if you're comparing the two, and you're looking at the elasticity and some of the lighthearted moments of the characters, even the script of the new Good Times, then it seems like it's a satire of the old Good Times. Because the old Good Times, I would say the portrayal of African Americans living in the ghettos of Chicago, I would say that was an outstanding presentation of that family for the world. The integrity of the father, the battle to keep their kids out of the street, the episode where they were fighting to keep JJ from being part of a gang and JJ gets shot. It was a very serious and powerful media vehicle for African Americans that remember it from those years ago. It was really a very powerful drama, even though like Urkel and some other characters, JJ kind of helped make it light because of the dynamite, but it was a very serious, but it was a very serious show. It was a drama. This new show was not a drama in the least. Okay, it may address some of the challenges of today's modern family that may be struggling with paying the bills. The father's a taxi cab driver, which of course is different from James, because James, I'm not sure where he worked. Like he was a dishwasher one week, worked at the car wash, I thought, which is the 70s. And now, just as bad, he's a cab driver in the era of Uber, autonomous vehicles, metro systems. It's like, how are you making money? I think the biggest thing I have that's going to be hard for a lot of people is that this new Good Times is a comedy, it's a cartoon, and it doesn't have the same weightiness or circumstance that the original Good Times had on the heels of powerful social commentary style shows like Archie Bunker, The Jeffersons, and those other types of shows. It's so
Does
different.
it move our society forward in a way? I think that's what some people have a problem with. Whereas some of the Norman Lear originals were somewhat provocative, and it made us address the way that we think about race or the way that we are dealing with inequality or lack of access. Like when we had James in Good Times trying to find a job and being in job discrimination and things like that. Where I remember even Wheezy and the Jeffersons would face job discrimination and things like that. This version, I don't know, like you said, if that's really the underpinning of the comedy there, or if it does
Yeah.
address or attack some of those social inequities in an intellectual way, rather than it plays upon some of the tropes that we've kind of gotten used to. I mean, you have a baby that's selling drugs.
Yeah, I was
And
going to mean that.
and
Yeah.
this is kind of interesting because
Hmm.
in Family Guy, you have Stewie who does some
Hmm.
nefarious things as well, but he is almost like a brilliant mad
Right.
scientist kind of nefarious, while this baby is kind of like the social reprobate drug
Right.
dealer, entrepreneur. So again, you have some of these
Hmm.
stereotypes that have run throughout our community,
Yeah.
and I guess it's just less comedic because of
Yeah.
that perpetual standard rather than in a show like Family Guy or another cartoon with created by Seth MacFarlane. There's a little
Hmm.
bit more nuance to it, and I believe MacFarlane is
Hmm.
behind this one too as well, isn't he?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
And for me, I think that's a little tragic. The portrayal of a black child, especially in light of we have a justice system that has treated some of our youngest people as adults prematurely. And now you have a show that I don't want to say, and again, I started this off saying that it's more of a comedy, right? So it should be lighthearted, but some of the things that's shared in popular culture might be taken the wrong, they have some meaning to it. But just to portray a baby, as a full-fledged gun-toting drug dealer, um, that's hard to swallow. I don't know, and I know there's a certain maturity that is required to laugh at yourself or to laugh at situations. And maybe if it was a family that was a different heritage, I might laugh at a drug dealing baby. I'm having a hard time with that. I don't know if that's something that other people have a hard time laughing at or making light of. I think one of the first episodes, the drug dealing baby saved the family because he has drug money to pay for the rent, and James was too stupid to realize to make money as a cab driver. And by stupid, I mean he was going. They had a scene. He was going around. This is again, it's comedy. He's going around as a cab driver, giving rides, and people are shorting him money, giving him fake money, or giving him like poker chips or whatever, like a sobriety chip. But then someone gives him 5 bitcoins, and then he deletes it right away. He's like, "Oh, you're trying to give me bitcoins?" He deletes it right away, which I was like, "Oh my god, bitcoins!" Someone gave him, So it's I don't. It's a new era. Like was that Good Times was what 50? What was the 70s? Is that 50 years ago almost? Right?
like 40 years ago.
40 years ago. So
Yeah.
it's a new era. People are
Okay.
different. Circumstances are different. And we're looking at this family through the lens of the old Good Times, which is a different time period. So I'm open to seeing what people are saying about it. I can see how it can be painful, and I can see how if you're looking at through the lens of the Image Awards, I don't think this may not win any Image Awards right away. I'm still waiting to see some of the other episodes, but there's some things refreshing about it. I think Mike JJ is not as much of a buffoon as he was in the earlier Good Times, but he's just as talented an artist. I think the mother is a bit more industrious, maybe not as good an actress as the original Florence. But there's some things I like about it. There's some things I don't like about it. But it's a cartoon, so do I just laugh and let it go, or do I, how much scrutiny do we give to a comedy, a cartoon comedy? Family Guy, the dad's a buffoon. Simpson, the dad's a buffoon.
The thing,
Both
the
shows,
thing
the youngest sons are some type of deviant. But now,
Right.
Good Times, dad's a buffoon, kid's a deviant. Is it the same pattern, different lens?
Yeah, I think there's a way that things are contextualized some 40, 50 years ago, like the original Good Times, and the way that it is now. I think that things are spotlighted
Mhm.
in our society a little bit more than they are in white society because there are so many more people in white society where you could say there's a spectrum of
Mhm.
people and personalities where uh, Black people are somewhat considered a monolith in some ways, even though we're not. We sometimes are, or we're depicted as a monolith. So, for example, why couldn't the baby be deviant or nefarious in some other way than being a drug dealer, which
Right.
is often associated with our society. The father being inept, I guess that is a common trope amongst men in cartoons as it is,
Hmm.
but doesn't mean that it had to be for this cartoon. So there's some mixtures in there where there seem to be some very wide reaching tropes among various societies, but then there's some that seem to take off of the usual stereotypes from our society as well, which I think some people are having a problem with. But they also say it's not that funny. I have seen an episode.
Really?
I could
Okay.
see how it's comedic.
Hmm.
Were there any ha ha moments for me? I can't say that there were,
Hmm.
but I could see if you are a person who, just wants to sit down and with a bucket of popcorn and watch something that isn't too uh,
Serious.
intellectually
Hmm.
stimulating,
Yeah. Yeah.
how it could have an appeal. It's kind of just
Hmm.
one of those things. But I did want to touch upon another topic tonight, something maybe a little bit less controversial, and that's the death of O.J. Simpson. And I'm just kidding on that, but O.J. Simpson died this month, and there was a way that O.J. Simpson had changed media and the way that we cover him, the way that we cover court, and we have to remember that he made a huge impact, whether you like him or hate him, people on both sides of that issue, obviously. But we really wanted to focus on the way that his trial, of course, after the homicide of his ex wife and his ex wife's friend, how that changed the media landscape. And that would be our focus for this part of the segment here. And I wanted to get your feelings, DK, on how you felt OJ changed the media landscape and the media environment because of what was called the trial of the century.
Oh wow. I think it was hard for every American, whether it's just lay people, but also professionals. As a professional journalist, you really had to assess yourself before covering it because the O.J. Simpson case polarized America sharply among racial lines. And
Yeah.
so you could almost say if you are a white American around that time, you assumed he did it. No doubt about it. No trial had to be had. He did it. If you are a black American, you may assume that he didn't do it. And I remember I was in school. I'm not sure what level of school, but I remember applause when he got off, or when he was deemed not guilty. But then also I remember the realizing that the rest of America was sad or angry because he was not guilty. And so for media professionals at that time, how do you cover the story in a way that people can accept the realities of the case? You're covering the case and sharing the facts, but then you also have to look at it through a lens where the majority of America, because remember, African Americans are not the majority of America. The majority of America thinks this guy is guilty. How do you cover it? Or a minority of the country is adversely affected by this, or feeling strong emotions toward this. How do you cover this? And I think it's really an ethical issue. It's an issue of really being. I think you had to actually be more of a detailed reporter back then, because it's so easy when everyone believes one thing, or a lot of people believe one thing, to just start trying to reinforce that one item, as opposed to reporting the story. What was it like for you? What was it like for you? I think you were still relatively very very young as a
I was pretty young, yeah.
yeah,
I
you were all
mean,
young, yeah,
comparatively to the age
yeah.
I am at now, it was definitely something that we were all riveted from watching because it was on television all the time. Court TV was pretty much augmented because of the O.J. Simpson trial. We had other journalists who came out of that. Abrams, I think his name is Dan Abrams, if I am
Mhm.
remembering his name correctly. Star Jones. There were others. I know that I'm probably maybe even Nancy Grace. There were definitely some people who came out of reporting on the O.J. Simpson trial, but we saw pretty much nonstop coverage an athlete who had a fall from grace, all the details of that, and it really opened up a gateway, I think, for a lot of people who wanted to become legal correspondence. And I think that's something I thought of, except for the mounting college debt that I had. Otherwise, I was accepted to law school at one point, and I thought about going, but then I got a job. So then I said, okay, this is a time for me to pay off my school loans and everything. I didn't end up going to law school. But I think that thinking about the way that the O.J. Simpson trial was being covered and the way that it intersected with law made me think that that was a possible uh, that was a way for me to just claim my own space in the journalism industry, was to be a legal correspondent, and a lot of people have done that successfully, and they made big careers off of it. So I think it was a big opportunity for journalists. I do think that there was obviously a division in America because you had so many people coming from our society who knew that there were police out there who were not on the up and up, who were not straight, who were
Right.
not, and by straight I mean legally and
Mhm.
following the correct procedure, obviously. But then you had those from white society who are already comfortable with black men or black people in general being viewed as criminals. So there was that assumption, kind of like what you said, DK, where you had some people who thought that he was guilty already, which is antithetical to our justice system, right? You're supposed to be innocent before proven guilty, but those who said he was guilty before he was acquitted, right? So
Mhm.
that was one thing. But of course, when we look at just the history of law in our country and how it's been misapplied, how you often see people who look like us on the wrong side of the law when it comes to the death penalty being disproportionately represented, people who are facing life sentences being disproportionately represented, those who are exonerated because they were innocent the whole time being
Mhm.
disproportionately represented. You had those who were very skeptical as to the guilt of O.J. Simpson, and I think that's what made the case so enthralling. And then
Right.
when you had Johnny Cochran with that glove moment, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. I think that was a phrase that many of us will remember for the rest of our lives, where it really was
Mhm.
a turning point in that case, but it helped us, kept us viewing, right?
Yeah. And well, not only were you viewing the case, you were viewing the reaction by Americans to the case. You know, man on the street views were more important, just as important. The reactions of people across America, that was a story, as much a story as the actual verdict of the case. Because it was polarizing, and then America had to assess, how do we cover something that is so polarizing among racial lines, in such a way that we are professionals, that we have ensure that the stories are balanced, that stories reflect a broad swath of America as opposed to maybe just the mainstream Americans. But then also you're looking at, can a black man can a rich, well-to-do, let's make sure everyone knows OJ Simpson was one of the most prolific running backs, NFL running backs, National Football League running backs of all time, and he was probably at the peak of his popularity. He was a popular actor. He was a comedic actor. He was very popular, not necessarily in the African American community, because he was actually more so popular in the mainstream media, in the mainstream community. So you
Yeah,
have this guy
he
that
was
has
a
one of the,
household name. He was a
yeah,
household name. He
yeah,
did
yeah.
commercials. He was in movies. He was
Mhm.
that kind of that crossover guy that really did not embrace race like some of others of us from society. He was a
Yeah,
person who, I think one of his most famous quotations is, "I'm not black, I'm OJ." So he was a
right.
person who was sort of seemingly white
Mhm.
friendly during that time, especially when you had other members of our society who were talking about race and
Like Jim
talking about it
Brown.
a
Mhm.
very profound and aggressive way, and calling attention to the inequalities in our media and in our society. O.J. Simpson was a person who didn't really perseverate on that, thought of himself as somewhat, I guess, neutral in race, someone who could appeal to the white community more than other members of our society. And for that reason, he was very popular. And it was a serious fall from grace when we saw him on trial. But that ends our episode 9 of the Capitol Press Club Legacy Podcast. We have many more topics that we'll be discussing in future podcasts. We want to thank you for listening. And of course, I got to thank my co-host here, Derek Kenny, who's always working behind the scenes and helping to put this all together. We will see you or hear you next time on the Capitol Press Club Legacy Podcast. I'm your host, Colin Campbell, saying peace out.